been talk about this for a while. He's still, how old is Michael? He's about 60, I suppose.
He's 56.
56, right, even younger than I thought. He's got plenty of, petrol left in the tank. And, I suspect we may see some diaries from Michael Gove. There have been rumours that he's been writing a diary. And I think he'll want to go back into journalism. Who knows? I mean, I think at one time, better be careful talking to Times Radio, but I think at one time, Rupert Murdoch did offer him the job of editor of the Times. So maybe that will come his way, in the future when there's a vacancy. That sort of thing. He'll want to write. He'll want to make a bit of money because, being a journalist and then, as he was, and then being an MP and a minister, he's not as wealthy as some of his contemporaries from university days, and indeed some of his contemporaries in politics. Although by public standards, of course, those are well-paid jobs. So I should acknowledge that.
Do you think the fact that polling in his constituency put him just 1 point ahead of the Liberal Democrats may have had something to do with his decision?
Yes. There are quite a few. In fact, many of these retirements that we've seen are from people who've looked at the polling or looked at the trend and say, hey, I'm going to lose my seat or it's going to be a tight race. I'm going to have to work really hard. And in the case of somebody like Michael Gove, if he was to have lost his seat on election night, that would have been, the so-called Portillo moment, or possibly the Portillo moment of 2024. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg could be that now, because he's, so far as we know, still standing.
Still standing. Jeremy Hunt this morning confirmed he will still be standing as well.
I think we'll get probably another 10 Conservative. I've been saying for a long time now that the figure for Conservative retirements won't reach the 100 figure. And that was the figure of Labour retirements way back in 2010 when the Brown government came to an end. Exactly 100 in 2010 Labour retirements out of exactly 150 retirements overall. But it'll be into the 90s. There are at least half a dozen people you can add to that list who have been squeezed out of their current seats because of the boundary changes and are desperately looking around for a new seat, including the Conservative Party chairman, Rick Holden. Most of those are not going to get new seats. So there'll be forced retirements, sadly for them. And I think given the rate of retirements over the last 2 or 3 days, I think we can see a lot next week. They don't have to announce it. And for quite a while yet. The close of nominations is Friday, the 7th of June. So that's nearly 2 weeks, 13 days from now. And on past form, there will be some people who decide to make the decision at the last moment, not giving their parties much time to choose a replacement, which really annoys the parties, of course. And there's been an element, I think, of people holding back because they can't make their minds up. In some cases, the parties like them to hold back, so they've got the excuse, the party high command has got the excuse of saying, we haven't got time for a proper selection, forget about the members, here's your candidate. In other words, what's called parachuting in a candidate, somebody favoured by the leadership, somebody that the leadership wants to get on the Commons benches and perhaps bring into government.
So that was going to be my next question. You were saying this morning the Conservatives have got about 150 seats to fill. Is that...
No, it's around about 200.
Oh.
Now, nearly all those seats are hopeless seats. Frankly, if the party wasn't to field a candidate in those seats, people wouldn't really notice. They've got the ones that matter. They've got 31 seats, which are notionally Conservative on the figures from the last election imposed on the new constituency boundaries. So you've got 31 seats that people, if they're budding Conservative MPs, ought to be interested in, and which the party, in many cases, like Bognor Regis, has spent months without selecting anybody for unknown reasons. And, of course, that number, 31, is going to go up if there are further Conservative retirements. So you could see 40, 45 quite attractive Conservative seats available. But, the Conservatives in the present state are not really going to gain any new seats. They might just gain 1 or 2. But, they're not going to gain new seats in significant numbers. So anybody standing for a seat that isn't a Conservative seat right now is making a bit of a sacrifice and must expect not to win. And no doubt they'll do it for experience and putting down a marker.
And what does this do in the selection of the candidates process? So you mentioned that sometimes leadership, and this applies to Labour as well, they quite like it all last minute because they get to choose the candidate and bypass the local groups. But what does it do about the quality of candidates? So we're looking at the Reform Party, who want to stand candidates in every constituency. You're talking about Conservatives need to find almost 200 people. What does that do to the quality of candidate we can expect?
Well, in the hopeless seats, I think some of the quality may not be very high.
Right.
And I think the Conservatives, they've got to fill 170 hopeless seats. And I think they could struggle to find people to fill those seats. They probably will in the end, but there'll be a lot of arm twisting, a lot of local officials persuaded to stand, a lot of what are known as in the trade as paper candidates. All they are is they've signed the forms,
name on
a name on
ballot.
a paper. There might be one leaflet. They won't do much campaigning, if any campaigning. And a lot of these hopeless candidates, in the case of the Labour Party, candidates in hopeless seats have to sign a contract saying that they're committed not to fighting their own seat, but to going off to a nearby seat.
To help in a neighbouring seat.
In a named nearby seat, to help on a certain number of days, and including polling day. And the real test, if you're a voter, of whether your candidate is a serious candidate or not, is to say, will you be campaigning all day in this constituency on polling day? And if if a couple of hundred Labour seats candidates are being honest, they'll have to say no. We're going to be down the road in somewhere a bit more promising for us. But now in terms of the last minute seats that the party holds, you could get a lot of quality there, because that's the moment when people like Starmer and Starmer's office and central headquarters and Sunak will put in place people who have been their advisors. And advisors tend to be pretty clever people, but they haven't had the time to go to the local associations or the local parties. And the problem is these days also that local associations, local members, and let's face it, local voters like their candidates to be local. That is a much, much bigger trend than it was even 20 years ago, which makes it very difficult for really bright people who've got a job in London. There's only one or two places that you could genuinely say are local to you. And this enables the party leaderships and the party high command to get round that. I mean, there's all sorts of other things they're doing right now. I mean, for instance, for Labour, there's a man called Gerard Coyne, who was secretary of the Unite trade union in the West Midlands. Twice he stood against Len McCluskey for the leadership. And Tom Watson and people who are allies of Gerard Coyne and the Labour MP John Speller have been sort of rooting for Coyne for a while now, and it looks like he's going to be installed in a new seat called Tipton and Wednesbury. I mean, other Labour people are applying for that seat, and my advice to them is don't bother. It's going to be fixed for Gerard Coyne, and there are other seats that are going to be fixed. I suspect Rochdale, for instance, will be fixed for Paul Waugh, a frequent contributor of yours, who tried to be the candidate for the Rochdale by-election. Labour lost that, of course, because they had to disown their candidate. Labour, and it's up against George Galloway, so it's a tough fight. But I think that'll be fixed for him. Yeah. And you can sort of see where things are being fixed if you look closely and
things
make the
fall into
inquiries.
place.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating process. I mean, the other thing is that various people are being sacked. A couple of Labour MPs have been sacked very quietly in the last 2 days. Diane Abbott, I expect, will be sacked from her seat in Hackney on perhaps Tuesday or Wednesday.
Do you think sacked or again?
Well, sacked by the party.
By the party.
There's nothing to stop her fighting it as an independent.
Right. But you don't think she's going to be given her whip back and allowed to stand down?
It's not looking that way, but I might be wrong. And I haven't spoken to people at the centre. I just reading the signs. Mm-hmm. And what's happening now is that Labour are imposing candidates on these good seats without even any, the local members even having any say. The old trick, the normal trick would be they draw up a shortlist of 3 names, and it would be sort of, a brilliant candidate, somebody who's clearly got an amazing CV and a record, and then there'd be a couple of duffers. And the local members, haven't got any choice, really, but to shoot. That's how Tristram Hunt, for instance, got chosen in Stoke-on-Trent, the historian, in 2010, I think it was. Yeah. And in fact, I was there. And the other candidates, they really were not that great. And so he won by something like 85% of the membership. And that's the old trick. You draw up, the shortlist where people have got no choice. Though occasionally the local members resent this. They resent a shortlist, a bad shortlist like this being imposed on them, and they rebel and they choose one of the duffers. And that's why we got, one of the reasons why we got some MPs who are pretty mediocre.
Okay. I thought you were going to start naming names there, Michael.
Well, I will. Well, I better not.
Let me talk to you about postal votes.
Yes.
because they're quite important,
Yes.
aren't they? We know that when people get their postal vote, they are very likely to send it off within
Within 48 hours.
48
'Cause
hours.
That's the survey.
So is that something that parties are all going to be aware of? They need to
Yes.
get those key messages out to grab those postal votes.
It's one of these things that the parties are all quietly aware of and that journalists very rarely talk about. We keep talking about, we're all going to the
I'm
polls
talking
on
about
polling a day. Yeah, I know you are. That's great. But everybody talks about we're all going to the polls on polling day. Not quite. About a quarter of the population will vote by post. And they can vote by post remarkably early. It varies from local council to local council. The close of nominations is on Friday, the 7th of June. And so the really keen local councils will get their ballot papers printed maybe that weekend, or certainly at the very start of the following week, and then start distributing them. So it could be as early as the 12th of June or the end of that week, and certainly by the beginning of the following week. So we're talking about what, the 12th, the 19th, 20th, around about the 20th of June, the postal ballots will start arriving. And this is 2.5 weeks before the official polling day. And as you said earlier, most people who get postal ballots, they tend to fill them in and send them off within 48 hours. And so they can't change their vote after that. Their vote's gone. And if you think about it, there'll probably be several thousand people who by polling day will have cast their postal ballots and died. I mean, if you think about it, their votes can't be taken out. So, what it means is that the parties have got to campaign for a bit of a mini climax early on, round about the 20th of June, maybe a bit earlier than that. And they've got to get their messages across by that time and have a very strong message that time, in the knowledge that a lot of people will be voting.